Unfortunately for those involved, the last few months of World War II saw some of the bitterest fighting throughout the entire conflict. As Hitler's Nazi troops continued their retreating action into the heart of Berlin, the Americans were pushing back the heavily entrenched Japanese forces island by island, but with terrible losses. The final few battles for the Pacific and European theatres had been set up by years of battle around the globe, from the deserts of northern Africa to the muddy fields of Western Europe and the cold Russian landscape to the humid jungles of Indonesia. There was war weariness the world over, and as the civilians of the once proud Axis nations continued to suffer at the hands of the now aggressive Allies, pressure was mounting in all corners for peace. However, it would take several final acts of destruction before this could be brought about. In Europe, the combined Allied forces were ensnaring Germany in a pincer movement from the east and west, forcing the last bastions of Hitler's defenders into their capital. The push was really gathering pace, and by April 1945, the empire that the Führer had promised would last 1,000 years seemed on the verge of collapse. There were also considerable advances being made in the Pacific, with the Americans preparing for Operation Iceberg. The target was Okinawa, only 340 miles from southern Japan, and the largest of the Ryukyu chain of islands. If an amphibious landing was successful, Okinawa would provide the Americans with a springboard for the final invasion of mainland Japan. Less than a week earlier, Iwo Jima, the first island in the Japanese archipelago to be invaded by the Americans, had finally been declared secure after 6 weeks of bitter fighting. Immortalised by photographs and film showing US Marines and a US Navy medic raising the Stars and Stripes on top of Mount Suribachi 5 days after the first landings on 19th of February 1945, the Iwo Jima fighting had cost the lives of 6,825 American and 21,703 Japanese soldiers. Although an Allied victory, the Battle of Iwo Jima was a chilling prelude to Operation Iceberg. For the invasion of Okinawa, the Americans assembled a force of 102,000 soldiers, 88,000 Marines, and 18,000 Navy personnel under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the 10th US Army. Supporting Buckner's troops was a massive fleet of 1,600 ships, including 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 32 cruisers, and 200 destroyers. The warships lying offshore and carrier-borne aircraft were at battle stations, ready to blast Okinawa into submission. The bombardment of the beaches at Hagushi began at 6 a.m. and lasted for a grueling 3 hours. However, when soldiers from the 3rd Amphibious Corps stormed ashore, they found no opposition at all. Follow-up troops rapidly headed inland and had, by noon, taken the airfields at Kadena and Yomitan. By nightfall, the 10th Army had more than 60,000 men ashore, and the beachhead was now 9 miles wide. But the Japanese were nowhere in sight. In fact, Okinawa's Japanese garrison had positioned itself well inland to avoid American naval gunfire, many concealed in the caves of the island's rocky landscape. The Japanese 32nd Army defending the island was 120,000 strong, and 70,000 of them were regular army troops. They were good, battle-experienced men, but the remaining 50,000 were a mix of naval troops and locally conscripted islanders who were poorly trained and inadequately equipped. Even so, the Japanese had plenty of artillery, and the terrain without a doubt favoured a defensive position. At 60 miles long, being an average 8 miles wide, much of Okinawa was made up of hills covered with pine forests and thick undergrowth. Renowned for constructing strong and well-concealed defensive positions, the Japanese were ready and waiting for the enemy as the battle for Okinawa commenced. But by April the 3rd, the Americans had reached the eastern shore, effectively splitting the Japanese forces on Okinawa in two. General Buckner quickly initiated Phase 2 of his plan, the objective of which was to take the northern half of the island. The 6th Marine Division advanced towards the Motobo Peninsula on the western side of the island, where they encountered Japanese troops defending a natural fortress of wooded ridges and ravines. But by the 18th of April, the Marines had cleared the Motobu Peninsula. Most of the northern half of Okinawa was now in American hands. In the meantime, the Allied invasion fleet off Okinawa had come under a ferocious assault from the air. The Japanese High Command had assembled more than 2,000 aircraft on airfields in southern Japan and Formosa, today known as Taiwan, to disrupt the invasion of Okinawa. And despite bombing raids on their bases by American B-29s and carrier-borne aircraft in the weeks before Operation Iceberg, many were still ready for action. However, they weren't intended for standard bombing runs or escort duty. The aircraft were packed with explosives and aviation fuel, and were piloted by young men known as the kamikaze. They were well aware that their attacks were one-way trips, prepared to sacrifice their lives in order to do maximum damage to the American ships. Kamikaze meant divine wind, and was named after a typhoon that had destroyed invading Chinese warships in the 13th century. Japanese command hoped that their new divine wind of pilots would be able to destroy this modern threat. On April 6, 1945, the Japanese Operation Chrysanthemum began with massed kamikaze attacks on the Allied invasion fleet. Although fired up with fanatical devotion to their emperor, most of the kamikaze pilots were novices, and Allied fighters managed to shoot dozens of them down well before they had a chance to do any damage. But there were plenty of kamikaze who did succeed in breaking through, and for 2 days, anti-aircraft gunners on board Allied warships fought desperately to knock them out of the sky. An incredible 13 American destroyers were badly damaged or sunk, and it was a threat the Allies needed to take very seriously indeed. Over the next 3 months, several hundred more kamikaze pilots smashed their explosive-filled aircraft into Allied warships, with the vast majority being killed in the process. By the time the conflict on Okinawa came to a close, this type of attack had sunk 36 vessels and damaged another 368. The loss of American lives was even greater though, with 4,907 sailors killed and a further 4,874 wounded, all by kamikaze attacks. Despite these losses, survivors needed to prepare themselves, as the land battle for Okinawa was just beginning. The highest concentration of Japanese forces were to the south of the island, and on the 4th of April, General Buckner ordered the 24th Army Corps to advance in a southerly direction from the American beachhead. As the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions pushed on towards Shuri, Okinawa's ancient capital, they met fierce resistance from Japanese troops defending a position the Americans had christened Cactus Ridge. There was a bitter hand-to-hand struggle for Cactus Ridge, but by the 9th of April, the Japanese had been toppled from their vantage point, but at a high price, with 1,500 American casualties. But the way to Shuri was still barred by Japanese defenders along the Kazuku Ridge, and the fierce fighting continued until superior American firepower forced the island's defenders to call off further attacks. Even so, Buckner's advance had stalled, and the fight for Okinawa was anything but over. While the fighting across the island intensified, the war in Europe finally came to a close. On the 2nd of May 1945, the remaining German military, now without their illustrious Führer, capitulated to the Russians, sending a signal to all those involved that the end of the Second World War was in sight. Elsewhere in the Pacific, the British had forced their way through imperial defences in Burma, finally taking Rangoon. The Japanese mainland was also being attacked with little opposition, and in the Philippines, American troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had managed to contain more than 200,000 Japanese soldiers on the islands of Mindanao and Luzon. Again, resistance was fierce as the Japanese fought bitterly to hang on to their mountain strongholds. But on the 26th of June, MacArthur was finally able to declare that the Philippines campaign was over. Ironically, it was also late June, the 22nd to be precise, that the Okinawa campaign was declared officially over. It had lasted a grueling 87 days, and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers had perished in the fighting, with at least another 7,000, mostly local conscripts, taken prisoner. A further 100,000 Okinawan civilians are also thought to have died during the fighting. Although victorious, the Americans paid a terrible price, suffering more than 50,000 casualties with at least 12,000 fatalities. Figures like this really hit home that despite the war in the European theatre being over for more than 6 weeks, World War II was still very much continuing. The Japanese had repeatedly served notice that concluding the fighting in the Pacific was going to take all the Allies' resolve to see it through. However, there was an alternative to continued island-hopping invasions. A new technology was being trialled in the United States, one so devastating as to cause any nation it was used against to have no option but to capitulate. Secretly, since 1939, America had, in cooperation with the UK and Canada, been working on the Manhattan Project. Based on Einstein's work in nuclear fission, scientists had been diligently performing research with his theories, and on the 16th of July, a breakthrough was made. The atom bomb had been created, and Harry S. Truman, only in office for a few weeks, was now responsible for its use. Meanwhile, as war continued to rage in the Pacific, there was still no end in sight for the battles of the Far East. For the Japanese, to surrender was a fate worse than death, and driven by ancient traditions, they were determined to fight to the very last man. As Allied casualties continued to rise, and the United States prepared for their invasion of the Japanese home islands, there were soon grave decisions to be made. And in the final stage of the global conflict, steps would be taken to defeat the Eastern enemy, which would transform the face of war forever. However, the nuclear option wasn't the only one being considered. Throughout the spring of 1945, Allied troops had driven back the Japanese into the core of their home territory, making it possible for a full-scale invasion of mainland Japan. With this in mind, plans were put together for a massive operation known as Downfall. Japan was an archipelago made up of thousands of mountainous and volcanic islands, making the invasion a daunting prospect. Of the 4 main islands, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu and Shikoku, there were few areas suitable for invasion. Only the beaches on the Kanto plain of Honshu, southwest and southeast of Tokyo, and the beaches of Kyushu presented suitable attack zones. The Allies decided that a 2-stage invasion should be launched, the first of which, codenamed Operation Olympic, would attack southern Kyushu. After building air bases here, cover would then be provided for the next step, Operation Coronet, which was the attack on Tokyo Bay on Honshu. Operation Olympic was scheduled for November 1st, 1945, and the combined naval armada would be the largest ever assembled in the history of warfare. 14 US divisions were scheduled to take part in the initial landings, and once the invasion of Honshu was underway, 25 divisions would be involved. The main concern for the Americans was the potential for huge casualty rates. The Japanese had demonstrated that they were willing to fight to the death if necessary, and there were also fears of biological warfare, which the Japanese had used during their war with China. It was estimated that there could be over 1 million US casualties during the attack. In the first 6 months of 1945, US casualties in the Pacific had exceeded those suffered during the previous 3 years put together, and put Allied commanders in no doubt that any attempt at invading the home islands would indeed lead to not thousands, but possibly millions of casualties. As Operation Downfall was begrudgingly put together, President Truman and his generals were faced with an incredibly tough decision. Commit the combined air, naval and ground forces of the American military to a long drawn-out campaign against an enemy that for all intents and purposes had lost but was unwilling to admit so, potentially losing hundreds of thousands if not millions of lives, or commit one of the most devastating acts of violence the world would ever see by using the atomic bomb. The latter option, while horrendous in its destruction, would shorten the war and massively reduce American casualties, which Truman was keen to do. The decision was made. As Truman began to make all attempts to exclude the Soviet Union as an invading force, the race for Japan was on. At 20th Air Force Headquarters in the Marianas, Curtis LeMay and his staff worked around the clock to devise a plan for the use of the new top-secret weapon against the enemy. The Soviets, in the meantime, were gathering forces on the border with Manchuria in southeast China, in preparation for their agreed invasion of Japanese territory, scheduled for August the 8th, exactly 3 months after the surrender of Nazi Germany. 2 days before the proposed invasion, the Allies received an inscrutable message from the Japanese Prime Minister. This was the final gesture of defiance for Truman, who ordered that a B-29 named the Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother, be loaded with the atomic bomb. It took off from the main runway on the island of Tinian and set off for its target, an important military centre called Hiroshima, civilian population 300,000. It was a calm, sunny Monday morning, and the city was bustling with activity, when at 8:15 a.m. the bomb was suddenly dropped. The devastation spread over 4 square miles, killing 30% of the population instantly. Humans and buildings alike disintegrated in the explosion, and the firestorm that ensued claimed many more lives. All that was left of Hiroshima by the time the smoke had cleared was a wasteland of flattened streets, many of its inhabitants now nothing but shadows, burnt into crumbling walls by the blast of white light. 4 hours after the attack, the Japanese government didn't know what had happened, and were only given some indication when a plane was dispatched to survey the city. A huge cloud of smoke was still rising above Hiroshima, but the true horror of the situation was only just beginning. The Japanese soon realised that this attack was far more devastating than any that had gone before, not simply because of the massive damage done to the city, or the fact that so many died in the initial explosion, but that there was little hope for any survivors in the area. Almost all those that didn't succumb to the initial blast were now dying in a much slower and painful manner, radiation sickness. While Japan reeled from the attack, President Truman made the announcement that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and sternly warned if the Japanese do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on Earth. 2 days after the attack on Hiroshima, the Soviets began to storm across the borders into Manchuria on August the 8th, ending all hopes the Americans had of keeping the Soviets out of the Pacific Theatre. But Tokyo still failed to respond to the call for an unconditional surrender, and on August the 9th, Truman carried out his threat by dropping another bomb on Japan, this time on the city of Nagasaki. As another city crumbled into ruin, the Japanese government and the emperor realized they no longer commanded the fate of their country. Faced with further nuclear attacks, Emperor Hirohito was forced to put aside any hopes of an honourable end to the war. The endurable must be endured, he announced, and finally, on August the 14th, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration and agreed to unconditional surrender. 1 day later, President Truman made the speech that the world had been waiting for.
Forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
On August the 30th, US troops of the 6th Marine Division landed on a beach south of Tokyo, marking the beginning of America's occupation of Japan. And as US command was firmly established, the stars and stripes were triumphantly raised over the Japanese homeland. Representing the Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese Foreign Minister Shigemitsu formally surrendered for his country and committed Japan to the complete disarmament and surrender of all military forces. And when all the nations that had taken part in the Pacific battles had signed the document, MacArthur drew the war to a poignant close by saying,
"Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always."
The Second World War officially came to an end at 8 minutes past 9 on September the 2nd, 1945. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Japanese now laid down their arms. On September the 4th, Imperial forces surrendered on Wake Island, 3 years and 4 months after the Americans had been driven from its shores. And so ended the largest conflict the world has ever known. Millions had died. Territory and cities were scarred from a conflict that raged for almost 6 years across many countries and continents. It was the dawn of a brave new world. And while we have echoes of this long drawn-out war even today, as long as we continue to remember the mistakes of our past, we stand a good chance of not repeating them.